eventually we're going to hit the top of that business cycle. And it's unfortunate because right now we're in a neighborhood that's quite nice. The streets are very straight, but when we go into the next recession, the neighborhood changes, and unfortunately for the worse. Now, it's a very, it's not as nice a neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood we don't know as well. And for central banks and governments, it's in sort of uncharted territory. So what do I mean by that? Well, look at this next graph, and again, the gray bars are where we've had a U.S. recession. The blue line is the U.S. federal funds rate, so short-term interest rates. And you can see whenever we've had a recession, the U.S. Federal Reserve, and this is past 7 recessions, U.S. Federal Reserve has cut interest rates on average about 5%. Right now, federal funds rate, short-term overnight rates are about 1.5%. They think, the Federal Reserve believes that at the peak, they're going to get to 3%. That's still not enough to cut 500 basis points. Monetary policy is not going to be as effective in the next recession, and that's a problem. Unfortunately, fiscal policy is also not going to be as effective. You can see from this chart, it's showing past administrations what their average deficit to GDP ratio is. And you can see the Trump administration, it's predicted over his 4-year term, let's hope it's only 4, is going to be almost as much as the Obama administration. But the key point here is that was during the Great Recession. The Trump administration has been during a recovery. And this is the criticism of tax reform in the US and tax cuts is that it's happened so late in the economic cycle. So that would be a concern, that you won't have enough room for fiscal policy when you need it, when you have the next recession. Now, if government debt is the problem in the US, Canada has a problem with consumer debt. And you can see from this chart, the upper right quadrant is where you have countries that have high consumer debt, and it's growing quickly. You can see where the US was before the housing bust. You can see where they are now. So the US consumers have delevered. But this is where Canada is. We have high consumer debt, and it's growing. The only thing good I could say about this is that we're not alone. Switzerland, Australia, Korea, and a lot of Scandinavian countries also have high debt levels. The problem for this, for Canada and these countries in the next recession, this is going to be a real headwind to a recovery. And if we have a housing bust in Canada, a lot of this consumer debt is going to turn into government debt as people default on their government-insured mortgages. So this is something, a concern in the next recession. Because of this, because you don't have fiscal policy, you don't have monetary policy, we think in the next recession you're looking at 2 paths. So on the one hand, you have deflation. And this is really sort of what we had in the Great Recession, this idea of a secular stagnation where you have low productivity growth because of high debt levels. On the other hand, Mr. Truman, we have inflation potentially. And this idea, if the US Federal Reserve lets the economy run hotter going into the next recession, you could have stagflation because of higher inflationary expectations. There are also some secular forces acting on the economy in the future. One of them, demographics. Now, I would maintain this could go either way, deflation or inflation. There's a school of thought, as we age, we spend less money, and so that would be deflationary. But there's also a school of thought that says that we actually spend more money on healthcare. And also, if there are less people working, if there are more retired people, there might be upward pressure on wages. So I think that one could go either way. Automation is definitely deflationary, where I'm going to make the argument that globalization or a lack of globalization is inflationary. But ultimately, this is going to be a policy decision by the central banks and governments. And you have to decide, which path do you want to take? Do you want to risk deflation and a deflationary spiral when you have a lot of debt? Or are you going to try and inflate your way out of it? And I think, given the experiences of the Great Depression, the U.S., would be more worried about deflation. Deflation is the consensus pick, but I think that actually inflation is a legitimate scenario, such that I would put a 40% probability on that happening.